As rare and desirable locomotives go, one can't beat the Rf-16 Shark. As I mentioned in the previous video, the last two examples of this locomotive to operate, both D&H engines, suddenly disappeared in the late 80s. Then, in around 2013-14 or so, the locomotives magically appeared out of seemingly nowhere, to much the delight of many rail fans who had missed them. Models of this locomotive are more plentiful, but mainly more vintage. There are some exceptions, however, such as this Bachmann variant right here that I tested a few years ago. Check that video out if you're interested in more. I'll put a link in the description. As we can see, it kind of worked on its own time. Continuing what Bachmann's current tradition seems to be, jacking up the prices on models that really aren't all that high quality and then trying to sell them as economy models that are great value for money. Okay, maybe I can't quite blame Bachmann for this one because, well, it's been out of production for so long. The prices are going up because of the rarity of the engine. However, it still doesn't excuse how badly the decoder on board was or its performance. I won't lie, something has always attracted me to these beautiful engines despite the fact that they're very rare and pretty much don't match any timeline of any model railroad unless you're freelancing. Of course I do, which lets me get away with that. Still, I could never get myself to actually buy one. There was a period in time in which I ordered two of the Broadway Limited Rf-16 Sharks, considered the ultimate model of this particular locomotive. Then, ironically enough, I found that the RS-1 was going back into production from Atlas with DCC and sound from the factory. Having seen that, I promptly canceled my pre-orders for the Rf-16 Sharks from Broadway Limited and promptly turned around and ordered the RS-1s from Atlas. The main reason was simple. I've always loved the RS-1 with a passion, and it would be a much more practical addition to my fleet. The idea also of getting sound on board with the Loke sound system definitely didn't hurt things either, as the Broadway Limited systems, let's face it, were always a bit on the pokey side in the past. And yes, I'm talking about you, Blue Line. Piece of darn frickin' sorry. Anyway, where was I? Oh, yes. So, as a result of this, the dreams of owning an RF-16 Shark were put on the back burner, and I essentially all but forgot that the engine existed. Then a couple of years ago, or about a year ago now, as you know, there was this thing called the pandemic, which found me sitting at home a little bit more than I like to. I was very happy to be working, don't get me wrong, but, well, one likes to have recreation, and as we all know, some of the states, like mine, locked down and made that pretty much impossible! Sorry. I certainly understood the health and safety reasons for locking down because of the virus, but still this doesn't change the fact that looking at four walls tends to get old pretty quickly. Anyway, to get myself out of this rut, I decided it was time that I just buy one of these locomotives because after all I really wanted one, and yes, it was overpriced on eBay and I won't say how much I paid for it because I feel like strangling myself to this day. In the end, though, I simply came to the conclusion it was worthy of the investment. After all, it was the pandemic and I needed something to cheer me up, right? Or at least that's what I've been telling myself. And here it is in its black box with its cellophane covering. As you can see, this particular model is a member of the Paragon 3 family of lines that Broadway Limited produces. This is essentially an older model that does not have the current Keeper technology they have. I forgot what they call their system. Essentially, it's another version of TCS's Keep Alive, where the engine will not stall on any weak points in the track. It's engine number 1205. This was actually a bit of a mistake on my part, as I wanted to have the other model, which was, I believe, was 1216, so I could then have a set of two of these locomotives, both numbers, that is to say, to represent the real ones that still apparently exist, according to all of my research. But, well, it's too late to rectify this, as these locomotives are now completely and totally out of stock, even on eBay. Maybe I'll get a chance to rectify this at some point in the future. Opening the box, we see its traditional Broadway Limited and seemingly traditional model train with a guidebook and slash operating manuals showing you how to work with the unit, and also advertising the Rolling Thunder system, which is a unique sound system by Broadway Limited whereby the bass can be enhanced from the locomotives by connecting a subwoofer into your DCC system. I'm not going to be using it, but it is available to you. The guide is comprehensive and walks through all the functions, adjustments, etc. to make the locomotive sound louder in some features or quieter depending upon your preference, light adjustments to the lighting, etc., as well as the speed, step, and acceleration controls. Going further into the box, we see that the locomotive does come with a 1-year limited warranty from Broadway Limited itself. Not sure if that's going to work, as this model is a couple of years old. Again, this locomotive is an out-of-production, new old stock model, not one that is currently in production. As with all locomotive models these days, it comes with a with a comprehensive parts diagram for helping you disassemble and maintain the locomotive and to order parts. Again, that's something that's become particularly tricky lately, although I have to admit even before the pandemic, parts availability could be sketchy from some manufacturers. Going further into the box now, we see that it has been actually double padded with one side of foam on top and one on the bottom, which is becoming traditional at this point. I will note that the foam has been a little bit damaged, indicating this engine's been sitting in there for a while. There are some detailing parts on the side there, which I believe those are standard horn hook couplers. Nice detail to add in there. Not many people use those, but there's still some that hang around with them. And again, this is an older model, so it isn't too surprising. The locomotive itself at first glance looks pretty sharp. The paint pops out, and unlike the Bachmann locomotive, we see that there are all the little rivets and everything else are in place. In sharp contrast, the Bachmann itself's details such as these front grab irons, etc., all were sort of molded into plastic. Here they're physically applied to the locomotive shell itself as separate detailing parts. Here's another shot of those front grab irons and the actual front classification lights, which do actually function on this particular model, even if they only light up in one color, which is white. And here's another nice touch. You can actually see through the rear fan grille and actually see fans in there. In sharp contrast, Bachmann's model actually has these all blackened out, so you can't actually see anything through them. The trucks on the locomotive model have a great three-dimensional effect, in sharp contrast to the Bachmann version, which basically looked kind of stamped out of one piece of plastic because it well was. The underbody detailing of the locomotive is somewhat limited, but then again, what did you think this model was? A Rapido? Okay, I'll stick to my day job. Back again to the comprehensive part list and diagrams, we see that the locomotive actually possesses axle bearing pickup, in sharp contrast to the Bachmann again, which use the infamous wheel wipers, which will need to be cleaned separately from the wheels themselves and will eventually go out of shape. In sharp contrast to the fancy box and detailing of the Broadway Limited model, the Bachmann locomotive was much more austere, with a very cheap and somewhat beaten up box, as admittedly this thing had sat on the shelf for who knows how long before I took delivery of it, and then my own shelf for who knows how long after that. Cheap plastic replaces the high-quality foam in which the Broadway Limited model came in, with only a little plastic cellophane on top of the locomotive to protect it from any scratches from the very hard plastic, and again inexpensive plastic, cocoon. Details such as the little rivets are actually molded into the plastic instead of being separately applied, and they don't look very three-dimensional from any angle of view. The colors themselves also look somewhat less vibrant. Essentially, with this Bachmann model, you're flying economy, whereas the Broadway Limited is a first class model, at least in terms of its detailing. There's simply no way around that. Another missing detail on the nose here is the builder's plate. The locomotive is also severely lacking in underbody detail, but then again, what'd you think this was? A Rapido model? Okay, I'll stick to my day job. With the detailing out of the way, let's go through the sound effects this locomotive possesses. Number 9 is the startup sequence. It wouldn't be fair, admittedly, to call this an improvement over the Bachmann, since the Bachmann, well, didn't come with sound. Nonetheless, it is still refreshing to have it. Here's the bell. The horn. The coupler clank, which didn't want to respond. I believe that to be the dynamic brakes. It's either that or the dryer. And the manual notching mode, 5 increases, 6 decreases. And the previously mentioned classification lights, which can be triggered by using function 7. Another detail I must note is that the number boards actually illuminate on this model and the headlight is worth something. Right now I have it dimmed. That can be controlled by pressing the F10 key, which will in turn activate the brighter version of that light. That's enough of the sound features. Let's blow the horn, sound the bell, and take her for a little run. I was immediately impressed with this model locomotive's ability to crawl slowly right out of the box. Again, I left the DCC settings as default for the purposes of this test. The sound effects at first here sounded pretty darn good, although unfortunately first impressions would prove to be deceiving. Unfortunately, I was about to encounter a much more serious issue with the locomotive.
Oh dear.
And yes, that's right, derailing issues, something I cannot stand, especially from a new model. And unfortunately, this issue would persist. After giving the locomotive a good once-over, I discovered that the problem appeared to be this bracket that's right in front of the truck itself, which appears to be there to protect the bell underneath the body of the engine because of its unusual location. Essentially, as you can see, it's jamming the truck and not allowing it to have its full range of motion, which of course, in any case with a model like this, can lead to serious issues with staying on the tracks, especially on tighter turns. I ended up trimming this and then in fact cutting it off by mistake. I had meant to trim it, but at any rate, it did successfully fix the problem. I could have, I know, probably tried to send it back for warranty work, but considering the fact that these engines were out of production for so long, and considering the fact I just wanted this thing to work, I was more than willing to deal with the solution I came up with. Not that the other locomotive had this detail to begin with, and I really wouldn't miss it very much, therefore. With the derailing issue out of the way, I focused on the sound effects, which initially I was very impressed with, but then I began to notice something. The engine, much like the BLI's Blue Line edition, didn't really have much in the way of notches for the prime mover. This is to say, you got it going up to a certain speed, and it didn't have any change in sound effects for the increased speed the prime mover was supposed to be revving to. It essentially seemed like it stayed on notch 3 no matter how fast you pushed the engine. Kind of a weird quirk. The lack of any kind of capacitive power backup in the locomotive's board and/or DCC system became very sorely missed, as in any weak point in the track, the engine would essentially stutter. This is why, thanks to the rapid progressive technology, especially in model railroading as of late, buying a diesel locomotive model or any kind of locomotive model, even from more recent times, can have a notably less enjoyable experience compared to a locomotive that was just released. And again, this locomotive model debuted sometime around 2015. Another nice feature you won't find on the Bachmann locomotive is the reversing headlight on the rear of the engine. Overall, the motor control was pretty decent for the model itself. There was a slight whine in the motor itself, but nothing compared to the infamous Bachmann motor and decoder sounds that we heard from that particular engine when I tested it. Overall, I was very happy with the performance of this engine. I just didn't particularly care for the fact that it didn't have current keeper or anything like that installed in it, especially for a locomotive in this price category. But again, we have to remember this model is a couple of years old, and the expectations back then, even in more recent times, again, were much lower than what they are now for an engine in this price class. Another nice little effect that Broadway Limited built into its own custom sound system was the brake squeal we just heard. Well, let's pull her into the yard and see how she handles that.
Good.
As we can see, the locomotive had no trouble with the tight twisty switches there. Now let's see how it deals with the infamously tight 15-inch curves back here around the engine house. And as we can see, no trouble at all. Again, the locomotive did stutter here and there, but again it lacks the keep alive performance. And I will also note, while it did stutter, it did not completely stall. Overall, it handled the yard very well.
Weird.
Now let's see how this locomotive and its train handles the mountain, which of course is one of the more challenging sections of my layout. Note, all trains need to make a reversing move to back into the yard and must back into the yard, as the yard is stub end and there is no through track in the Whitestone Yard area of my layout. Again, all trains must stop at the signal and wait for permission to enter the yard, and yet again our engineer overran the signal. This time the locomotive did cut out. Now while I understand that this thing doesn't have any kind of keep alive capacitor in it, I've had engines that can make it across this track without it, without an issue, mainly from that of Atlas. Why? I still haven't quite figured that out. Once again, the locomotive had no trouble with the tight turns, as well as the tight switch-out areas and turnout areas of my yard, and the mountain itself. Ha! Take that, Rapido M420. Yes, it did drop power occasionally and stall once or twice, but at least it stayed on the track. Big difference. As we can also see, the Broadway Limited Rf-16 had no trouble at all negotiating my inner track's twisty layout setup, which includes several S-curves and 18-inch turns here and there. I have, in more recent times, done work to this part of the layout, upgrading some of the track to nickel silver and correcting some of the tighter turns. Unfortunately, this all happened after I filmed this review because it, well, has been a long time since I did it. And now we come to the point in this review where I have to decide whether the locomotive is a buy or not. I would give the price, but that's kind of irrelevant since Broadway Limited has pulled this locomotive from production, and I don't even think it's on their website anymore. The same is essentially true for the Bachmann model. It's nowhere to be found, unless of course you were to head over to eBay. There a scalper will happily sell you one of these Broadway Limited or Bachmann locomotives with a huge markup. In my case, for the D&H model, which is no shock, the price went over $300 with shipping and taxes. Ouch. But then again, as I've mentioned before, the D&H paint scheme does that to models. The locomotive itself was not as good as some of the newest locomotives rolling off the shelf. That goes without saying. It's 5 years old, and technology in model railroading is moving much more rapidly than it used to. The general technology is bazillions of times ahead of where it was when DCC came out way back in the day in the late 90s. And it actually started to get into the mainstream, I should say, in the late 90s. There was also that detail part that was jamming the truck in place and not allowing it to make the tight turns. Having to correct that out of the box certainly isn't a mark for this locomotive. And while I certainly wouldn't call this locomotive perfect by any means, the fact of the matter is it's a huge improvement over the Bachmann locomotive. If you remember, that locomotive had enough trouble just moving by itself, and when it did move, the decoder engaged in an excessive whine, and it found every possible chance to stall. And yes, while this locomotive did stall, it was far fewer times. Couple that with the fact that this engine is much better detailed and overall operates smoother, it really doesn't have any flaws that I can point to that would be a no-buy in my opinion. The one exception, of course, being that infamous detail part that jammed the truck in position. Bottom line, if you're looking for a model of the Baldwin Rf-16 Shark and HO scale, this and the Bachmann model are really the only two places to turn, and in my opinion, this is definitely the superior model. And while it may not be perfect, it is still miles ahead of the Bachmann version. Just keep in mind that while this is not necessarily a vintage engine, or at least not what apparently is being called a vintage engine, at least not yet, it does have the lack of keep-alive capacitors and isn't quite as refined as some of Broadway Limited's new products. And that's going to do it for this video. If you liked it, thumbs up. If not, thumbs down. Please subscribe as it helps me a great deal. And as always, keep the metal side down.